Billings, stay here. We'll press on. Right. Abomination! 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 Who are you? What are you?
I'm an American. Keep your powder dry.
If you ask the average American how we won our independence, they'll probably tell you it was George Washington and the Continental Army. And that's not wrong, but it's not the full story. The Continental Army didn't even exist when this story starts. What did exist was a network, a sprawling, decentralized, leaderless network of ordinary people who had spent the previous decades quietly preparing for something they hoped would never come. And when it did come, the army was a consequence of that network, not the cause of it. You see, the revolution was won by a network built by silversmiths and printers and shoemakers, by country doctors with fast horses and Sunday school teachers who just knew everyone, and also by men who had never been in war, women who had never been in a meeting house that wasn't a church. And the man at the center of that network wasn't heroic by any Hollywood standard. He was just a normal person. He was a working class silversmith who quietly built the infrastructure that would save his culture and his country. This is the story of how he did it and what it should mean to us now, because we probably have more in common with this person than any other figure in the entire American Revolution. His name was Paul Revere. You've heard his name, you know the story. One man, one horse, one night, the British are coming, except none of that is quite right. He didn't yell the British are coming. I mean, heck, half the people in Massachusetts at the time still thought of themselves as British, and he wasn't alone. There were dozens of other riders out that night, and he didn't even finish the ride. He got captured. So why is it that we remember guys like Paul Revere? Because what Revere actually did is way more impressive than the legend. The legend is just a guy on a horse, but the reality is a man who spent 40 years building the network that made the ride possible, and the ride was just one product of that network running at full output. This isn't a story about a hero. It's a story about how regular people built a civilian intelligence and alarm system that outperformed the most professional army on Earth. And today, we're going to look at what is, in my opinion, the most overlooked and historically undervalued dynamic of how we as Americans gained our independence and built our republic. Why? Because Jefferson was right when he said that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. But before the blood comes the work, and before the muster comes the meeting, and before any sort of alarm goes off, you have to build a network. And that same spirit of freedom that coursed through our forefathers is still alive in us today. And we are just as capable of works beyond ourselves when we know our neighbors, when we trust the people around us and that we live among, and when we build something together long before we need it. But 250 years later, we've forgotten what this dynamic even feels like. But by the end of this video, you will remember, and you'll understand deeply how our rebellious forefathers pulled off what today might feel impossible. This is the lesson that they will never teach in a school, because it's dangerous and it's unstoppable. The story begins in November 1715 when a 12-year-old French boy named Paul Revere stepped off of a ship in the Boston harbor all alone. He didn't speak the language. He'd been put on the boat by his uncle on the island of Guernsey because his family were French Protestants, and at the time the Catholics in France were killing people who believed the things that he believed. Some of his relatives had even been forced to convert at the point of a sword. He was apprenticed to a Boston silversmith, and he worked for 7 years, and when his master died, he bought his own freedom from the estate for 40 pounds, and he opened up his very own shop. And he got sued for debt 3 times, and he had to change his name from Revere to Revere because, as his son later put it, the bumpkins pronounce it easier. A self-made name for a self-made man. Later on, he got married to a Yankee girl by the name of Deborah Hitchborn in 1729, and their son Paul was born in December 1734. That's where this story really starts to pick up. Not with a hero, but with a refugee's kid's son growing up in the middle of a port town. You see, Paul Revere, he grew up in Boston's North End. If you've ever been there, you know it's a tight maze of crooked streets and weathered blackened houses. It's about 6 blocks from Saltwater in literally any direction you go. And he went to a Calvinist writing school at the time where the teachers literally beat the laziness out of you. And he learned his trade at his father's bench. And when his father died, Paul was only 19 years old. And suddenly he was like the man of the house, a teenage silversmith supporting his mother and siblings. Now here's the first thing about him that I want you to notice. When he was about 15 years old, Paul Revere and 6 other boys from the neighborhood drew up a written constitution to form a bell ringers association at the Old North Church. It's a historic church. If you ever go to Boston, you'll visit the North Church. Now, what the heck is a Bell Ringers Association? Well, a Bell Ringers Association was a group of boys, usually teenagers, who contracted with a church to ring its bells, because back then they weren't automated, right? So specifically, they rang change ringing. It's an English tradition where a team of ringers pulls a set of tuned bells and mathematically structured sequences. They're not melodies, they're patterns. And each ringer is responsible for one bell, and they have to ring it in a precise order that shifts according to the rules the team has memorized. Think of it less like playing music and more like running a coordinated drill, okay? There's 8 ringers, 8 bells. Each person has to pull at exactly the right moment relative to the others, and sometimes for hours at a time. And if one person screws up the timing, the whole pattern collapses. The bells weigh hundreds of pounds, some over 1,000, and the rope work is like seriously physically demanding. Now, Paul's little crew was called the North End Boys, and they were fascinated by these bells. I guess there wasn't, they didn't have Xbox Live. And they petitioned the church wardens for permission to form an association to ring the bells one evening a week for 2 hours at a stretch. So when he was 15, he learned a skill set that inherently teaches you that a group of people can produce a result that no one of them could produce alone. It teaches discipline, it teaches timing, and the absolute necessity of doing your part because everyone else is depending on you. It teaches that the pattern matters more than the individual. It's coordinated, collective action, drilled until it becomes second nature. Now, the covenant that they wrote is a whole other matter. It's very interesting because what's striking about the Bell Ringers Association isn't that they wanted to ring bells. It's that 7 teenage boys decided the way to do it was to write a constitution. They elected a moderator every 3 months, and all decisions were done by majority vote. No new members without unanimous approval, and they specifically wrote down that they wouldn't beg for money. They bound themselves to rules that they had made and agreed upon together. That is way more than a kids club. That's a miniature republic designed by 15-year-olds using forms their grandfathers had used to found towns and churches 100 years earlier. And in the 1750s in New England, this was just how you did things together. The boys weren't being precocious. They were imitating, almost unconsciously, the civic templates that surrounded them at the time. Then let's just think about the physical aspect of all of this. These boys spent years in a bell tower, learning to coordinate signals that could be heard for miles. So when the alarm went out on April 19, 1775, beacon fires, bells, drums, signal guns, the people ringing those alarms were grown men who, as boys, had spent 2 hours a night practicing this exact skill. Coordinated, audible signaling across distance was already a deep part of New England culture, and the boys who'd grown up in the bell tower or in the bell ringer associations, they were now the men running the alarm system. Now, the Old North Church is famously where the 2 lanterns hung that famous night. And people focus on the lanterns, one if by land, 2 if by sea, but they forget that the men in that steeple and the men listening for signals across the river were the kind of men who have been doing coordinated signaling since they were 15 years old. That's crazy. That's not normal teenage behavior. That's a culture. That's 6 generations deep that taught these kids that the way you do anything together is you write it down, you agree on rules, you elect leaders, and you bind yourselves by majority vote. Paul Revere was raised in this kind of society where ordinary civilians knew how to organize themselves, not because someone told them to, but because that's how their grandfathers did it, and that's how their grandfathers' grandfathers did it. It was culture, and you have to hold on to that because it matters throughout this entire story.
This Dirty Civilian production is powered by a few incredible companies focused on building capable, prepared Americans.
Night vision is expensive, but to celebrate America's 250th birthday, Steel Industries is offering some crazy sales. During the full month of July, you can save on everything from white lights to battery packs, helmet accessories, and yes, even night vision. There's nothing more American than owning military-grade equipment like night vision. And even better, you can buy from a company that supports your values and needs. Go to Steel Industries and hit the 4th of July tab at the top of the website.
War isn't some distant headline anymore, it's everywhere. Supply chains are fragile, inflation is hammering everything, and ammo prices are not going down anytime soon. Waiting to stock up just means paying more later, if you can even find what you need. That's where Ammo Squared comes in. It lets you build up your ammo stash over time, automatically. No panic buying, no guessing, just steady, consistent stockpiling.
A lot of dudes build their kit like they're assembling IKEA furniture, without instructions, and then they wonder why it sucks. Wetworks makes plate carrier and chest rigs that actually work together. The Super Slick plate carrier and the PF6 chest rig from Wetworks is one of our favorite combos. Low profile when you need it, scalable when you need a full loadout. It's clean, it's modular, and it doesn't turn you into a walking yard sale. If your setup currently rattles when you move or it makes you miserable within an hour of wearing it, we highly recommend this combo. Buying prepackaged survival kits can be a great idea until you figure out that the supplier saved money on key items like a fire starter kit or a signaling device. That's where Stay Ready Outdoors comes in. They don't cut corners. The gear is built around real-world use, reliable fire, dependable water solutions, and medical that you can actually trust when it counts. No filler items, no gimmicks, just equipment that works when you need it. Because when something goes wrong, you do not need subpar equipment. You need quality. Go to Stay Ready Outdoors.
Now I want to tell you about the parts of his life that nobody puts in the children's books. If you ever want to read a great book on Paul Revere, you can read his memoir. You can also read a book by David Hackett Fisher called Paul Revere's Ride. It's phenomenal. I read it over a decade ago. It's still one of my favorite books of all time. But anyways, most people don't know this, but Paul Revere had 16 children across 2 marriages. 5 of them died as infants. 5 more died as young adults. Of his 11 brothers and sisters, 5 died in childhood and 2 more in early adulthood. He buried his first wife, Sarah, after she gave him 8 kids in 15 years, just absolutely worn out by deliveries. Every time one of his children got sick, he wrote about being overcome by what he called like an agony of fear for his little lambs. It didn't get any easier with practice. It crushed him every single time. And as most of us who are fathers or parents understand, like nothing ever gets easier. You just get stronger. You know, we're not talking about a guy who was a serene patriot statue. He was a man who lived with grief, a lot of it, and he was a complicated dude. For example, in 1761, when he was only 26 years old, he beat the hell out of a guy named Thomas Fosdick, what a name, who was a hatter who had married one of his cousins, and no one really remembers what the fight was about, but Revere got hauled into court for assaulting and beating his kinsman, and he was fined 6 shillings and 8 pence, and at the time that was about how much he'd make in 2 days of working. So in the modern dollar, for someone in his line of work, it would be about $500 to $1,500. Not nothing, but not so much that it would ruin his life, right? And he had to put up a bond for good behavior in order to get out of it. Also, in the year 1765, the year the Stamp Act was being debated, somebody tried to attack Revere's property because he owed 10 pounds that he just couldn't pay. Today, that debt would be about $2,800-ish, and he settled out of court, most likely having to borrow the money from friends or family members, and just barely stayed afloat in a global economic depression. Now, I want to stop the story here for a minute, because if I just keep moving, you'll miss the most important context for everything that follows. The year is 1765. Paul Revere is 30 years old at this point, and he has a wife and a household of kids. He's a skilled tradesman in what should be the prime years of his career, and he's about to lose his shop over a minor debt. You see, you need to understand what is happening to him, but not just to him, but to everybody in this world. Because the version of the revolution where people fought for high principles, where they cared about liberty in the abstract and read Locke and had gentlemanly debates and wigs, that version is real, but it's also incomplete. That's the version that is told by like lawyers and gentlemen. But the version that put Paul Revere in his saddle was much simpler. He and his fellow colonists felt like their government was breaking them, and they had to do something about it. You know, the 7 Years' War, what we call the French and Indian War, ended 2 years prior, and that really set the stage for everything that followed. Now, the 7 Years' War was technically one of the first world wars, but within North America, it was a fight for territory between England and France, with the Native Americans kind of in the middle who had been playing both sides for fools for years in an attempt to preserve their own autonomy, right? But in this war, the Native Americans sided with the French. England sent troops, but also called upon the colonial militias to help out. And about 30,000 colonists fought throughout the war in nearly every single major battle. Paul Revere was one of these militiamen. He actually fought. In 1755, at the age of 20, he joined the Massachusetts militia as a second lieutenant of artillery, and he served in the failed expedition against Crown Point. He came home in 1760 after 5 years of intermittent service, having seen real campaigning. He was not a hero of the war, and he didn't write about it much, but he learned what military operations actually look like, how camps work, how supply chains move, and how orders flow, and how men respond under pressure. That experience is in the background of everything that he does later. Now, through this conflict, the colonists learned to coordinate across colonial lines. This is an under-recognized part of the story that most people never know, because before the war, these 13 colonies, they barely talked to each other. They thought of themselves as Virginians or Bostonians or New Yorkers, not Americans. The war forced colonial governments to coordinate troop deployments, share intelligence, run joint commands, and negotiate with each other and the Crown over money and manpower. And in 1754, Benjamin Franklin presented his Albany Plan of Union at a meeting of colonial delegates called specifically to coordinate the war effort. It was rejected, but the habit of intercolonial coordination was being built right there. Now, the committees of correspondence that drove the revolution 20 years later were not invented from nothing. They grew out of these communication networks that first stood up during the French and Indian War. Now, during this conflict, the colonists also learned that the British Army was beatable. This matters more than most people realize, because before 1755, colonial Americans believed British regulars were the finest soldiers in the world, well-trained, well-disciplined, unbeaten in open battle. But after witnessing some major defeats, that belief was permanently broken. Colonial militia officers watched British regulars die in formation because they refused to take cover, fire from behind trees, or fight in any way that violated European doctrine. You know, the colonists fighting beside them, they used terrain, they used cover, they used irregular tactics, and they survived. And this lesson sat in the colonial mind for 2 decades and informed how they thought about resisting the British Army in 1775. Also, during this time, colonists kind of became acutely aware of how much the British Army didn't respect them as civilians and militiamen. British regular officers routinely and consistently treated colonial militiamen as inferior, undisciplined, poorly trained, socially beneath them, all the things, right? And colonial officers, regardless of how senior they were in their own service, were ranked below the most junior of British regular officers. And Washington spent years famously furious about this. You see, many colonial veterans came home with a grievance against the British military establishment that they had just fought alongside. They had bled for an empire that didn't think they were worth a damn. And when the same empire started taxing them after the war, the resentment just skyrocketed. You know, the colonists had fought, they'd bled, they had died, they had even paid taxes to win the war. And when the war ended, Britain looked at the cost that doubled their national debt and decided that the colonists should pay for the rest of it with extra taxes. And through the new taxes like the Currency Act, the Custom Enforcement, and eventually the Stamp Act, people were losing their minds. You know, to the British Parliament, this seemed reasonable. The war had been fought to protect colonial interests, so the colonies should have to help cover the cost. But to the colonists, it looked like absolute betrayal. We all kind of know what it feels like to be betrayed by our own government. They had raised troops, they had taken casualties, they had taxed themselves to fund colonial regiments, they had spent their own blood and treasure clearing the French and native threat from the western frontier, and now, having served the empire faithfully, they were being told that their reward was higher taxes, restricted trade, banned paper money, and standing British garrisons quartered in their very own towns. That's the gap that produced the revolution. And I think a lot of us feel a very similar gap this very day. Now, to bring this back to the common man, Paul Revere, while the war was on, British money had been flooding into Boston. Army contracts, provisions, shipbuilding. Boston had been booming. Working men had borrowed against the boom, like it still happens today, and taken loans for inventory, expanded their shops, bought property, assuming demand would keep going. But when the war ended, all of that stopped overnight, like a faucet shutting off. The army went home, the contracts dried up, and suddenly Boston was full of merchants holding warehouses of goods that nobody could afford to buy, and craftsmen like Paul Revere holding debts that they had no way to repay. Then the British Parliament made it even worse. In 1764, they passed the Currency Act, which banned the colonies from printing the paper money that they used for daily business. They just outright banned it, and instead they required colonists to pay British creditors in gold and silver, which the colonies didn't have because the only way to get gold and silver was to sell goods to Britain, and Britain is not buying stuff from us anymore. So imagine waking up tomorrow morning and being told that the dollar is no longer legal tender. You have to pay all of your bills in physical gold, but there's no gold in your town. There's no way to get gold. Every dollar in your bank account is now worthless, and your mortgage is still due Friday. That was 1764 in Massachusetts and in the 13 colonies. A year later in 1765, Parliament added the Stamp Act, a direct tax on every piece of paper used in colonial business. Every bill of sale, every contract, every newspaper, every legal document, pile it on top of an economy that was already collapsing. People were sick of it. Now picture this from inside Paul Revere's shop. He's a silversmith in an economy where no one can afford anything anymore, especially nothing new. So he's barely eking by just fixing old bowls and silverware and patching broken buckles and just scraping together small repair jobs. He's working harder than he's ever worked in the prime years of his life, and he's falling behind. That's most Americans today. His neighbors are losing their homes. People he grew up with, men who have been solid tradesmen just 6 months earlier, are showing up on the parish poor rolls. Some are killing themselves. The newspapers are full of bankruptcy notices. And this entire time that this is happening, the men who designed the laws causing it are sitting in London 3,000 miles away. They are so detached from the common man, and they don't even care. They don't even know Paul Revere or people like him exist. They've never even been to Boston. They don't see what their decisions are doing to the real people who have no voice in those decisions. They think they're solving a debt problem, but from across the ocean, it probably looks reasonable to, the man in the high tower. But from inside Paul Revere's shop and the home of every struggling colonist, it looks like something very different. Now, I want to be careful here, because I don't want to draw a cartoon for you. Not every American today is in this position. There are plenty of people who are still doing just fine, but many are absolutely struggling. And the mechanics of what's happening to us are different in some ways from what happened in Boston in 1765. They faced a deflationary crash. We're dealing with chronic inflation. They had no vote in Parliament. We still have a vote technically. But if you've watched the cost of a house double in your zip code while your wages stay flat, you know how the colonists felt, at least. If you've watched $1 in your savings account quietly lose a quarter of its value over just the past 5 years while being told inflation isn't real or my tariffs will solve this, you know how the colonists felt. If you've watched the response to working people falling behind become more enforcement on the end of the government instead of less burden, more agents, more audits, more rules, more compliance, you know how the colonists felt. You know, if you've ever sat at your kitchen table and looked at a stack of bills that you just can't really pay anymore and felt that ancient sensation of being managed by people thousands of miles away that you have never met and would not recognize you even if they had met you, you know how the colonists felt. The Revolutionary War was not started by happy men. It simply was not. It was started by tradesmen, by silversmiths, and printers and shoemakers and small shopkeepers who had built modest lives through honest work and watched a distant government systematically destroy what they had built. These were not all aristocrats, they were not philosophers, they were the same kind of people who today are quietly furious about things that they cannot quite name. So when Paul Revere almost lost his shop in 1765, one thing that he did that I want us to take note of is he did not despair. He did not flee, he did not numb himself. He simply joined a group. He joined a group called the Sons of Liberty. You've probably heard of them. He started showing up at meetings. He started learning who his neighbors actually were. He started lending his hand and his trade and his reputation to other people in the same situation. He started building things together with people who could be trusted. You see, the economic devastation that nearly broke him became the engine that organized him. The fact that he could no longer just make silver and mind his own business and be left alone was what forced him out into the civic life of his own town. The squeeze did not produce a legend. It produced simply a joiner. The legend came later, and only because the joiner had spent 10 years building the network that the legend would eventually need. So here's the picture before the revolution. A working class man in debt with a record of assault who had buried his father, several siblings, a wife, and is going to bury most of his children. Not exactly a Hollywood casting choice for the destined hero of the Republic. And I think this is a part that gets lost. The reason Revere became who he became wasn't despite the hardship. It was because of it. He was what people in that culture called a venturous conservative. Restless energy, comfortable with risk, but completely solid in his core beliefs. A man who had lost so much, he wasn't afraid to lose much. And there were many colonists in his exact same shoes. He was also, in the words of his neighbors at his funeral, followed to the grave by a troop of friends. This guy collected people his entire life. He was respected by his peers, which is one of the most underrated qualities that's rarely spoken of these days. It's one thing to posture to the masses and look like a righteous and successful guy, but it's another thing to simply be respected by your peers and your own family and the people that you live around. The latter is more telling of a person than anything else. He was what we would all consider not perfect, but a good man, like most of us. I want to make it very clear that Paul Revere was a follower more than he was a leader of anything. He was almost compulsively a follower. He was a leader in some sense, but not in the traditional sense that we think about, leaders, standing out in front and like commanding people and like delegating. It wasn't essentially that. Paul Revere was the kind of leader who just inherently knew how to work with people and how to galvanize people and how to kind of lead the way by example and have people just follow that example, though he himself was a follower. He's the kind of guy who, like, if you've ever gone to a leadership conference or a leadership summit and you listen to the keynote speakers say like, oh, here's my 34 ways to be a good leader, and you get a migraine because your eyes roll so far back in your head because it's just like overcomplicating a simple thing, which is like lead by example, do what is right, and be good to people. It's not that hard. That's how Paul Revere lived his life. So with that being said, let's lay out kind of a timeline of all the things that Paul Revere joined. As we mentioned earlier, in 1755, at the age of 20, he joined the militia as a lieutenant of the artillery and went to fight the French at Crown Point in the French and Indian War. The campaign was an absolute mess, but he came home in 1760 having seen real war. After that, he became an active Mason. Just hold on, I know the conspiracy theories, I don't think you're entirely wrong, but just hear it out. By 1770, he was elected a master of his lodge, and the lodge bought a tavern called the Green Dragon and turned it into their meeting hall. Then he joined the North Caucus Club, a political organization founded by Samuel Adams's father that met at the Salutation Tavern. That's a cool name for a tavern. The club was full of artisans and naval captains who picked candidates for town meetings, pure street-level civic machinery. He then got invited to the Long Room Club. It was a much more exclusive Whig society that met above the print shop of the Boston Gazette. Now, just a quick historical refresher, a Whig society was a political club opposed to British imperial overreach. They were pro-revolutionaries, right? Now, just a quick historical refresher for all of us, a Whig society was a political club opposed to British imperial overreach. Whig was the name colonial Americans gave themselves when they argued that traditional English liberties were being violated by the Crown and Parliament. Now, their opponents, loyal to the Crown, were called Tories, and the term came from English politics a century earlier, when the Whigs had won a constitutional battle to limit royal power and establish parliamentary supremacy. Now, by the 1770s, American Whigs saw themselves as heirs of that tradition. They weren't radicals, but rather constitutional conservatives defending rights they already had against a government that was trying to take them away. This is something a lot of people don't catch. You see, the American Revolution did not begin as a revolution. It began as a restoration movement. Whig societies were the organized civic infrastructure of that movement, ranging from mass membership clubs like the Sons of Liberty, which was, in the streets, to small elite cells like this Long Room Club that he's now a part of, where the senior leadership actually made decisions. Now, this club that he joined had 17 men. Almost all of them were Harvard educated. Lawyers, doctors, ministers. Revere was the only blue-collar guy in the room because they had trusted him. They needed somebody who could translate the decisions that they made into action that would actually happen on the docks and the markets and in the streets and on the drill grounds. He was the bridge between, if you want to call it, the wealthy and the poor. Another community that he was kind of a part of, or he kind of joined, was the one at Cromwell's Head, which was a tavern where the sign hung so low that you had to bow to enter. Like, just kind of a rough place, right? He was also a regular at the print shop of Benjamin Eads, where the Boston Gazette was printed. It was a newspaper that helped spread pro-revolution information. And just so you know, Benjamin Eads, by the way, he was the dude who dressed up like an Indian with a mohawk during the Boston Tea Party. Dude. Talk about like a newspaper owner and editor who, in his free time, moonlights as a guy who's just causing chaos and destruction in the Boston Harbor. Like, I bet the dude was super fun to hang around with. But I digress. Let's get back to Revere. In 1765, he joined the Sons of Liberty, and in the 1770s, after the Boston Massacre, he engraved the famous print that would shape American memory of the event for 2 centuries. But here's a fun fact. Wasn't even his original work. He ripped the design off of a guy named Henry Pelham and got it to market first. And of course, Pelham was furious. This is not a good thing to do. But Revere was a working artist. He understood marketing. It was definitely not a cool move, but we'll get more on that later. Then there was the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Good times. Revere was actually one of the organizers. The men were divided into separate groups, each told only the names of their own section commanders. They had cellular organization, they had compartmentalization. And in one of the books that I referenced earlier, Paul Revere's Ride by David Haggett Fisher, he has a really good quote, and I'm just going to quote it for you. He says that it was a classic example of cellular organization that would be used in other movements of a very different nature. You see, this is what operational tradecraft looked like in 1773. Now, after the Tea Party, when Boston needed someone to ride 350 miles to Philadelphia in just 5 days to carry the Suffolk Resolves to the Continental Congress, they sent Paul Revere. Now, just a quick refresher, the Suffolk Resolves were a set of 19 resolutions adopted by Massachusetts towns in September of 1774, and it declared the coercive acts, all these new laws that Britain had, it declared them unconstitutional, calling for tax resistance and militia mobilization and standing up a shadow government to replace the institutions that British Parliament had just dismantled. Now, once Revere delivered them, they were endorsed within a week, committing 12 different colonies back to Massachusetts if it came to war, right? It was an agreement. If it comes to war, we've got your back. And between 1773 and 1775, he made at least 5 major rides to New York and Philadelphia. That's a lot of miles to go, and he's making connections and banking up relational change with people all along the way. And I think that's really important to recognize because you see, there were 7 major Whig groups in Boston at that time, a total of 255 men. The vast majority, like specifically 82%, belonged to only one group. Nobody belonged to all 7 groups, and only 2 men belonged to as many as 5 groups. One of those was a man by the name of Dr. Joseph Warren, who was certainly considered a part of the elites, and the other was Paul Revere, a simple tradesman, a blue-collar guy. That's it. That's why he became who he became. He wasn't the smartest guy in the room. He wasn't a writer or a speaker. He never went to Harvard. In fact, Dr. Warren actually once said of him in kind of a backhanded compliment, he said that no man of his rank and opportunities in life deserves better of the community. Now, that's kind of like old English. In modern English, the translation is essentially like, considering his social class and the limited opportunities he's had in life, no man deserves more credit from this community than Paul Revere. You see, he was a bit of a nobody, but a nobody who knew everyone and who everyone knew. That's what he was. He was the connector, the guy who could walk into the lawyer's club and then the dockworkers tavern and then the Masonic lodge and then the print shop, and he would be welcome in all of them. The guy who knew everyone and was trusted by everybody. In modern terms, he was the network, not a node. He was the actual connective tissue, one person, and there were other people like him. Now, by the fall of 1774, things were sliding fast. General Thomas Gage, the British commander, who, by the way, was a decent man who hated the idea of war, he had begun a campaign of small surgical raids to seize colonial gunpowder before things got out of hand. And his logic was solid. If we take their powder, no powder means no war. No war means I get to keep my job and I don't have to kill anybody, because he didn't want to have to kill colonists. They were still British subjects. But the powder alarm of September 1st, 1774 is when this strategy of Gage's failed catastrophically. See, Gage's men, under perfect operational security, snuck out of Boston before dawn, rode up the Mystic River, and seized 250 half barrels of gunpowder from the Provincial Powder House. That's the building that held all the gunpowder stockpile for basically all of Massachusetts. And by noon, they were back in their barracks. It was a textbook raid, no shots fired. It was perfect. But then word got out. And within hours, garbled rumors were flying across New England. The province has been robbed. The regulars are marching. War has begun. 6 were killed. The king's ships are bombarding Boston. None of it was true. Not a bit of it. But it didn't matter. Rumors were spreading. The church bells rang. Beacon fires were lit. By the next morning, an estimated 20,000 colonial men were marching on Boston from the Connecticut Valley alone. 20,000. There's a guy by the name of Ezra Stiles, who was a clergyman, big statistics guy. He calculated that about a third of all of the fighting age men in New England were on the roads that day. This is before there's a war, before Lexington, before Concord. The civilian network in New England was already capable of putting tens of thousands of armed men on the road in less than 24 hours, all on a false rumor. Gage was stunned, to say the least. He immediately wrote back to England asking for 20,000 reinforcements. The king's ministers in London thought he was hysterical because it seemed just so crazy. I can just imagine him seeing the report of 20,000 colonial militiamen marching on the roads, and just, he just had, several hundred, maybe several thousand British regulars at his disposal, and he just started freaking out and just like, pin this quickly, send it off post haste, we need 20,000 men. And the guys back in England are like, 20,000 men for that, that rabble, those rebels, send them 400 Royal Marines. That will handle it. That will take care of it. And they did. They just sent him 400 Marines. Never underestimate the hubris of empire. That's a good lesson to remember. And in Paul Revere's own words, which he wrote in his memoir later on in his life, he wrote this specifically, and I just want to put this up there. It says that in the fall of 1774, in the winter of 1775, I was one of upwards of 30 chiefly mechanics. Mechanics, by the way, is how they refer to any kind of like working class guy, who formed ourselves into a committee for the purpose of watching the movements of the British soldiers and gaining every intelligence of the movements of the Tories, the Loyalists. We held our meetings at the Green Dragon Tavern. Now, Revere goes on to describe some of the OPSEC that they had. First of all, they had Bible oaths. Every member of this group swore on the Bible at every meeting that he would not reveal anything to anyone except a hard list of named individuals like Hancock, Adams, Doctors Warren and Church, and 1 or 2 others. They also had 2-man patrols. Revere wrote that we frequently took turns 2 by 2 to watch the soldiers patrolling the streets all night. He also had compartmentalization. The information flowed up through a small list of authorized recipients only. This is real tradecraft. This is like real stuff run by guys whose day job it was to make teapots and shoeing horses. Now here's where we need to like really slow down and pay attention, because this is the failure that proves the resilience of the network. One of the men on that hard list of like authorized recipients of this information was Dr. Benjamin Church, and it turns out he was a paid British informant. Every meeting, every name, every plan, he was funneling it all back to General Gage. Now, Revere knew something was wrong, and he wrote later that, and I quote, "A gentleman who had connections with the Tory party, but was a Whig at heart, acquainted me that our meetings were discovered, and mentioned the identical words that were spoken among us the night before." End quote. But Revere couldn't figure out who the leak was. The men in his group just started suspecting each other, and trust started to crumble and break down. And meanwhile, they kept reporting their findings to Dr. Benjamin Church, the very man who was selling them out, never imagining it that it could even be him. Like, he never even crossed their radar. They thought, oh, well, he's a trusted individual. He's a doctor, But Gage knew about Revere's network. He knew their meeting place, he knew their members, he knew their plans, and he chose to do nothing because it was better to keep his source running than to roll up a network and then just have to start over. This is a real intelligence failure. The good guys lost the counterintelligence game. So why didn't it matter? Why is Revere not a footnote in history about a busted intelligence ring? Because the network was bigger than the cell. You see, the cell at the Green Dragon was just one part of it. The real network was the 7 overlapping organizations that Revere belonged to, plus all the riders that he had been training on his Philadelphia runs, plus the militia covenants being signed by towns across Massachusetts, plus the doctors with the fast horses, plus the Charleston Winds, and 100 relationships built in taverns and lodges and print shops over 20 years. There were numerous cells. They all overlapped slightly. Compromising one cell didn't compromise the system. The system had no center. There was nothing for Gage to roll up. And at this point, what would become the American Revolution had no central commander. I think that's important to note. But it did have many leaders. Quite frankly, like, nobody was in charge. But that's not a weakness when your enemy is hierarchical. That's the whole point. Now, Revere and his group continued to monitor the movement of British troops and the activities of local loyalists, the Tories, all the way up until fighting actually broke out. And that is the part of the story that we're going to dive headlong into next, the night that the network ran. In the late afternoon of April 18th, 1775, a stable boy burst into Revere's shop and told him that one of his friends that works at a stable where British officers keep their horses, were talking there earlier, and they were working on their tack, they were getting their saddles ready, and they were talking quietly, and one of them said something about how there was going to be hell to pay tomorrow. There's going to be hell to pay tomorrow. Idiot! Revere thanked the boy and told him, "You're the third person who has brought me this same information." Crazy. 3 independent sources on the same day that came to Revere and told him this. It proved that the network was functioning. 3 different working class kids, a stable boy, somebody on the waterfront, and somebody else, all knew to bring the news to Paul because everyone knew that that's where information was supposed to go. They knew that he was the connective tissue. Now, by evening, Revere was already across the river, and also William Dawes, a Boston tanner and fellow son of liberty, was riding the southern route, both heading for Lexington to warn Hancock and Adams. Now, I want to kind of skip past the part that we already know. Like, we already know that Paul Revere had a ride. There were the lanterns, the crossing of the river, the horses, and I want to focus on what most of us miss or what is left out of this story. Revere did not ride alone. He didn't even ride the most. There was an unnamed rider that history never recorded, we don't know his name, who left Charleston at the same time as Revere headed north. And by 2 a.m., that messenger had reached Tewksbury, 25 miles away. He rode straight to the farmhouse of a man by the name of Captain John Trull, who was the head of the local militia, and woke him up. And Trull, in his nightshirt, picked up his musket and fired 3 shots out of his bedroom window. 3 shots. Oddly specific. Probably because it was a prearranged signal for the militia commander across the Merrimack River in Dracut. The Dracut militia started forming immediately, and by 2 a.m. the news had traveled 30 miles from Boston to the New Hampshire border. Just for context, 30 miles back then would normally take a full day's travel by horse. This was not improvisation. It wasn't Hollywood. It was engineered. I want to quote David Hackett Fisher because he described it perfectly in this book. He said that Paul Revere and the other writers did more than alert people one household at a time. They stirred New England's larger social and civic networks into action, moving deliberately through the region. The messengers contacted town officials and military leaders while also drawing in churches, ministers, doctors, lawyers, family connections, and local associations. That is just epic, to say the least. So let's talk through some of these elements. First, there were prearranged signals, 3 musket shots out of a window, then beacon fires, then specific bell patterns, a full cannon and a musket fire relay system. They also used doctors as riders because back in 1775, country doctors had the best horses in town. They had the fastest ones because they had to get to people quickly, and they pretty much rode at 24/7 all hours of the night, so it wasn't uncommon or unusual to see doctors on fast horses going around at night. So it was kind of a little bit of deception going on there so that British, any sort of Tories or loyalists in the area would never question why a doctor on a fast horse was running through the streets at night. Also, colonial doctors were disproportionately Whigs. They were pro-revolution. There was one guy by the name of Dr. Martin Herrick. He was a young Harvard graduate, and he rolled up multiple towns all in one night and then joined the militia for the march at dawn. There was also a guy by the name of Dr. Samuel Prescott. I love his story. He happened to be riding home that night from courting his fiancee in Lexington at 1 a.m. and he joined Revere and Dawes when they eventually got captured. And when they did get captured, Prescott just jumped his horse over a stone wall and escaped through a swamp and got the alarm to Concord. I think that's hilarious because this guy was, first of all, nothing good ever happens after midnight. He was out courting his fiance, and I guess the dude just had it in him that he didn't want to get caught by anybody that night. So there was a lot going on that night, but it wasn't coincidence. This cascade was engineered. You went from Revere to Dawes to Prescott's brother Abel, to unknown riders, to Sudbury, to Framingham, to Needham, where, by the way, an enslaved man by the name of Abel Benson alerted the outlying parts of the town with just a trumpet. That was a little bit of improvisation. And then Newton, then Dover, then Dedham, then Roxbury, then Watertown. This alarm circled all the way back to Boston from the west. Now let's talk about William Dawes, who was like Paul Revere but hadn't built the relationships, right? He did the same thing that night. He rode a longer route to the south on a slower horse, and only one person ever remembered meeting him that night. You want to know why? You want to take any guesses? It's because he didn't know who to wake up. Revere knew everyone. He knew which house in Medford had Captain Isaac Hall, the Minutemen commander. He knew that the Charlestown Whigs would have horses waiting. He knew which farm in Menotomy was Solomon Bowman's. He was the lieutenant of the militia there. The roads were the same. The horses were similar. The difference was 20 years of relationships. Now, Revere did get captured. About halfway between Lexington and Concord, a British patrol pulled him off his horse at gunpoint. He never even finished his ride, but he specifically chose that night to ride without a weapon so he'd have essentially plausible deniability and so he wouldn't be treated as a combatant. He factored failure into the plan. The hero of the Longfellow poem didn't actually complete his mission, but it didn't matter. Because by the time Revere was sitting on a horse with a British pistol to his head, the alarm was already way past him. Prescott was carrying it to the west. Other riders were carrying it north. The system was running without him. That's true resilience. Not because nothing went wrong. Revere got captured. The cell got penetrated. The intelligence about Portsmouth had been factually wrong on all the specifics. William Dawes was basically useless, but the network was designed to absorb these failures. No single point of failure existed because there was no single point at all. And that is why the muster worked. That is why Minutemen mobilized and headed towards Lexington and Concord. Now, there's something about that morning in Lexington that always gets oversold and undersold at the same time. The legend says that farmers dropped their plows and grabbed their muskets and ran to the green, right? Spontaneous, organic, the natural righteousness of free men. That's the Hallmark version. The real version, in my opinion, is way better. The real version is 6 generations of prepared civilians. 6 generations of training band tradition, every able-bodied male in every Massachusetts town was required to serve in the militia, with exemptions only for conscientious objectors, clergymen, college students, and the mentally incompetent. New England, by the way, was the first place in the world to formally recognize the right of conscientious objection. Now, in the fall of 1774, 5 months before Lexington and Concord ever happened, there was the Provincial Congress, which was the shadow government, essentially, of Massachusetts. It was an extra-legal legislative body that was formed when General Gage dissolved the colonial legislature. It was made up of the same elected representatives who simply kept meeting in defiance of British authority and effectively governed the colony through the outbreak of war. And they reorganized the civilian defense system. They made it so that any man between the age of 16 and 50 was a part of the militia. And if you were between 50 and 70, you were on the alarm list. And 1/4 of the militia would be designated minute companies ready to move at a moment's notice. And that's what's so beautiful. Like, these towns just built this network and this shadow government themselves. Some towns went fast, some towns went slow, some had elaborate systems, and some just had bare bones. You know, the Provincial Congress made recommendations, but it was the towns that acted as their own sovereign bodies. It was the individual towns that executed on their own. And new companies of Minutemen began drawing up old-fashioned covenants, like written agreements signed by every man in the same form that our Puritan ancestors used for founding churches and towns. Now, I want you to actually read the words of one of these covenants, one of these contracts, one of these agreements that militiamen had to sign. This one specifically was from the Methuen militia. It was written in 1775, and the spelling is super rough, so I'll translate. But remember, these are the words of working men, just blue-collar, normal people. These were not Harvard graduates. Again, this is my translation. Where military exercise has been much neglected, we, the subscribers, being the first company in Methuen, do covenant and engage to form ourselves into a body in order to learn the manual exercise, to be subject to such officers as the company shall choose by vote in all constitutional manner according to our charters. These are men who can barely spell the word neglected. They can't put 2 correctly spelled words together in a sentence, but they're writing constitutions for themselves. They're electing officers by majority vote. They're binding themselves by equal laws of their own making. This is civilians governing themselves at the most granular level. And speaking of governing yourself, Lexington taxed itself 40 pounds in November of 1774. This is 5 months before the battle. And the money went to mounting cannons, buying ammunition, drums for the training band, and carriage and harnesses for burying the dead. The town of Lexington was budgeting for its own funerals before anything had ever even happened. They saw the writing on the wall and they prepared accordingly. Now, here's another great example. Captain Isaac Davis, who is from the town of Acton, he built a private firing range behind his gunsmith shop. His company practiced there twice a week from November to April. And on the morning of April 19th, he was preparing to go and face the British at Concord. David kissed his wife, Hannah, goodbye. He stood in the doorway and started to say something, but couldn't really find the words. And so he just simply said, "Take care of the children." His wife knew, and she wrote later that by some mysterious power of intuition, she knew that she would never see her husband again. And he did die a few hours later at the North Bridge in Concord. That's the muster. It wasn't farmers grabbing pitchforks. It was ordinary men who had been writing covenants, electing officers, drilling weekly, and budgeting for coffins for months. They knew what was coming, and they were resolved to do whatever it took, even if it meant giving their own lives. They prepared on purpose. They built the institutions before they needed them. They took LARPing way more seriously than any American this day. And when the alarm reached them, they were ready. They knew what to do. Now, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, the British and the Americans both immediately understood that whoever told this story first was going to win it. So they raced. 2 days before the battle, on April 16th, Paul Revere's friend Isaiah Thomas, the editor of the Massachusetts Spy, packed up his entire printing press and his types, and he smuggled them across the Charles River using the Charleston network that Revere had built, and he got them all out of Boston, and he set up a secret printing press. All of this 2 days before the shooting even started. Now, within days, the Committee of Safety had mobilized justices of the peace to take 100 sworn depositions from eyewitnesses. The Committees of Safety, it was like the executive arm of the Massachusetts shadow government. It was a small, empowered body created by the provincial Congress to kind of procure military rations and supplies, to call out the militia, and to run the colony's defense in real time. One of the things that they discovered in this investigation is they learned that General Gage was sending his official report to London on April 25th aboard a really slow merchant brig, a ship called the Suki. So what did the committee do? They found the fastest boat they could, and it's called the Caro. It was owned by Captain John Derby of Salem, and they put together a deception operation. They set sail on April 29th, 4 days after Gage's ship, and he had confidential orders. Full speed across the Atlantic, sneak past the Royal Navy by going up to Ireland and cross the Irish Sea by stealth. Love the Irish, they've always been the homeboys, and deliver the depositions personally to the Lord Mayor of London. The crew wasn't even told the mission until they cleared the Grand Banks. Now, the colonial ship landed on May 27th. The British ship didn't straggle in until 2 weeks later. By the time General Gage's official version of the events arrived in London, the American version had already been published in every English newspaper. The British government was caught flat-footed. They couldn't even confirm or deny what was being printed because they didn't have any information. One supporter of the Prime Minister actually wrote very bitterly that the Bostonians are now the favorites of all the people of good hearts and weak heads in the kingdom. The dude was just big mad. What happened here was a civilian information operation run by a citizen committee beat the British state's official communications across the Atlantic and won the hearts and minds across all of Europe. They thought so many moves ahead. They had a faster ship. They had pre-positioned printing presses. They understood that whoever publishes first wins. And 2.5 centuries later, that lesson hasn't changed at all. So let's go back to where we started. Why do we still know Paul Revere's name, and why does his story matter more today than ever before? You know, we are 250 years into this grand experiment, and the lessons from that time are actually more relevant today than ever before. You know, Paul Revere wasn't a hero. He just wasn't. Really not in the way that the legend wants us to think. He had a temper. He got dragged into court for beating up his cousin. He had debts. He buried over 10 of his own children. His best intelligence operation was penetrated by a traitor sitting in his own meetings. His midnight ride ended with him being captured. Even his most famous engraving, the Boston Massacre print, it was ripped off from another artist. He was a real, fallible, complicated, working class guy. Like so many Americans today, what made him matter is that he spent his life, his entire life, joining things. The Bell Ringers Covenant at 15, the militia at 20, the Masons at 25, the Sons of Liberty at 30, the North Caucus, the Long Room Club, 6 different overlapping circles of people who built trust with him over years and years and years. No one is ever born the central figure in a revolutionary network. He became the central figure because for 40 years in every tavern and in every lodge and in every print shop that he walked into, he kept showing up, he kept being trustworthy, he kept getting things done. The midnight ride was not his big moment. It was his resume. Here's the thing that I think gets lost in the story a lot of times when the story is told. The most important word in this whole piece of history isn't liberty or tyranny or freedom, it's infrastructure. By April 1775, the civilians of Massachusetts had built, essentially over 6 generations, and especially over the previous 5 months, an entire parallel system of government. Town meetings, committees of correspondence, committees of safety, militia covenants, training groups, provincial congresses, networks of express riders, pre-arranged alarm systems, beacons, bells, trusted printers, pre-positioned presses, fast ships, sworn oaths, sworn depositions, small intelligence cells, and tons and tons and tons of guns and ammo. They built this in peacetime on purpose before they needed it. And when they did need it, the system absorbed every failure thrown at it. The intelligence cell got penetrated, didn't matter. The network was still bigger than the cell. The lead rider got captured, didn't matter. The alarm had already been passed way off, like it was already running without him. The intelligence was wrong at one point. It didn't matter. The response was right. It was basically just practice. Half the riders went to wrong houses that night, didn't matter. The next towns over still got the message and started their own riders. Resilience is not the absence of failures. Resilience is what you have left after the failures. The civilians of New England didn't survive April 19th because everything went right. They survived because they had built something that could lose pieces and keep functioning, because no single person was in charge, because trust was distributed, because the institutions were real. It's not until much later that you actually see guys like Washington and Adams and Franklin and Jefferson kind of take center stage and kind of take over the stories, right? That's the lesson worth taking from Paul Revere's life. Not that one man on a horse can save the day, but that ordinary people, given enough time and enough purpose, can build a system that's stronger than any one of them. The hero on the horse is just the part that you can see in a painting. The actual revolution was a network. So what does this mean for us? What does this mean for you? Well, like the colonists, we feel the overwhelming corruption of the government that presides over us. We feel taken advantage of, taxed to fund foreign nations' meaningless wars and to keep a predatory elite in power. We feel neglected, our cities and streets decaying by the day and our middle class shrinking while the crown sends our money and our countrymen off to die in foreign wars. We feel like our voices and our votes mean nothing, and in most cases, that's true, especially on the federal level. You see, the original Americans, they felt the same. They were in essentially the same shoes, but they did not give up hope. They didn't take the black pill. They just got to work. They pulled together even tighter as communities. They trained. They focused on building something righteous over breaking something broken. And technology has changed a lot since then, but humanity hasn't changed at all. It's still the same players in the same game. We just have different names and different tools. So like Paul Revere and the millions of colonists, I would say, do not despair. Do not give up hope. Build something better. Build your networks. Be the kind of person that no matter where you go, you are loved and respected. And you don't get there by being a garbage human being. You don't get there by disrespecting people. You don't get there by being unethical or disingenuous or posturing. You don't get there by being lazy. You get there by being a good person, period, and kind to your fellow man. You get there by serving your fellow man, by being someone who does what they say they're going to do, by being someone who helps other people even when it's an inconvenience to yourself, who prioritizes your own capability so that you can lend that capability to the people around you, and by being someone who creates this culture within their own home and within their own communities, a culture that will outlive you for a generation whose time will come to put these practices and these concepts and these tools into action one day. The future of our republic absolutely rides on whether we can keep this culture alive. And it's not just a bloodline of blood, but a bloodline of belief, of resolve, of ideas, the kind of inheritance that runs deeper than DNA. And we have a lot of work to do. But as history has shown us, and as Paul Revere's life has shown us, this is the way.